Nosferatu shouldn't exist. That's probably the simplest way to put it. When it was released in 1922, the courts ruled it was an illegal adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula and ordered all copies destroyed. Florence, Bram Stoker's widow, pushed hard for the ruling, and she got it. Every print of the film was supposed to be burned, every trace of it wiped out. But somehow, that didn't happen. Film collectors, archivists, or just plain luck. Whatever the reason, some copies survived. Not many, but enough. Those prints went on to cement Nosferatu's reputation as one of the most important horror films ever made. People still study it, screen it, and argue about its influence over the genre. But there's another side to the film's story, a quieter one that doesn't make it into academic essays or documentaries. It's said that not every reel of Nosferatu that escaped destruction is accounted for. Most of what survives matches the original release, but there are rumors, persistent ones, about other prints. Strange reels that don't align with any known version of the film. Some say they're incomplete scenes Murnau shot and abandoned. Others suggest they were never meant to be part of the film at all. Whatever they are, they're supposed to be different, and not in a good way. There are stories, as there always are with things like this. People who claim to have seen one of these reels, or to know someone who did. The details are always vague, but certain patterns repeat. Scenes where shadows don't behave the way they should, where figures seem to move in ways that defy explanation, or sequences that seem mundane at first, but leave you feeling uneasy for reasons you can't quite pin down. For the most part, these rumors are easy to dismiss. But then, there are the harder to ignore cases, the ones that make you wonder if there's more to the story. Two in particular stand out. One is strange and unsettling, the other horrific in a way that's difficult to even talk about. Together, they've become the foundation for the so-called curse of the lost reels. The first story comes from the 1970s, involving a private film collector in New York. His name doesn't appear in any official record tied to this, and those who have talked about him tend to call him by pseudonyms, like Mr. F. But enough fragments of his story have surfaced over the years to piece together the broad strokes. Mr. F was what you'd expect from someone in that world. Wealthy, reclusive, and obsessed with cinema history. He was known for seeking out rare prints, often traveling internationally to buy them directly from estate sales, archives, or other collections. According to one account, he came across an unusual reel of Nosferatu in a private auction catalog. It was simply labeled Reel 5. No provenance, no explanation of what made it significant, just the name of the film and the reel number. Naturally, he had to have it. The reel arrived at his home in an unmarked metal canister. Its condition was described as remarkably good for its age. Mr. F set up his projector that same night and watched it through. At first he was thrilled. It wasn't like anything he'd seen before. There were familiar moments, sure, but also extended sequences that didn't match the known versions of the film. Long, lingering shots of Orlok in his castle, staring directly into the camera. The angle didn't feel like something Murnau would have framed. It was almost confrontational, as though Orlok were aware of the viewer. Over the next few weeks, Mr. F became increasingly obsessed with the reel. He screened it repeatedly, noting minor details he swore hadn't been there on previous viewings. Friends who visited him during this time said he grew withdrawn and erratic, muttering about how the film changed when he watched it. He told one confidant that the shadows in the reel didn't behave the way shadows should, as though they had their own intent. Then, one day, he disappeared. The police were called to his home after neighbors noticed the lights hadn't gone off for several days. They found his house eerily empty, as though he had simply walked out in the middle of something. The only thing out of place was his projector, still running the Nosferatu reel on an endless loop. It was clear the reel had been watched extensively. Its edges were brittle, and some frames were warped from the heat of the bulb. The reel was taken into evidence, but it didn't stay there for long. Shortly after being logged, it vanished from police storage. There's no official record of what happened to it, though unofficially, several officers at the precinct reported strange incidents during the brief time it was in their possession. One officer claimed the shadows in the reel seemed to shift slightly when no one was looking. Another quit the force without warning a few days after viewing it. As for Mr. F, no trace of him was ever found. His remaining collection was auctioned off in the years that followed, but the infamous reel was, and remains, unaccounted for. The story is often dismissed as urban legend, but those who knew him, and who speak carefully of what they saw in that house, seem less certain. They don't like to linger on the subject, usually ending their accounts with the same vague warning. Some things weren't meant to be preserved. The second story is darker, much darker, and hard to dismiss as mere urban legend. It centers on a well-respected film historian, a man with decades of expertise in silent cinema. His work was widely regarded as meticulous, and he was a frequent guest at film festivals and universities, where he lectured on the history of early filmmaking. He was known for his professionalism and his careful approach to archival research, but all of that changed after he found the reel, while visiting a remote archive in Eastern Europe. According to those familiar with the story, the reel had been mislabeled and forgotten in storage for decades. The archive who showed it to him described it as unusual and unrelated to known prints of Nosferatu. The historian, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering something new, convinced the archive to sell it to him, paying a significant sum for what he believed was an invaluable piece of film history. When he returned home, he immediately began studying the reel. What he found was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The footage wasn't simply an alternate version or extended cut of Nosferatu. It was something else entirely. Disjointed sequences depicted shadowy, indistinct figures moving in ways that defied logic, jerking, bending, and twisting unnaturally. The lighting was erratic, with frames shifting between stark, overexposed brightness and deep, impenetrable blackness. What disturbed him most were brief flashes of a figure that appeared throughout the reel. The man bore a strong resemblance to F.W. Murnau, the director of Nosferatu, but this wasn't Murnau as he was known in production stills or portraits. In the footage, he seemed lost, wandering aimlessly through the strange, desolate landscapes. His expression was vacant, almost lifeless, and his movements were slow and erratic. The historian couldn't understand how or why this footage existed. It didn't fit with anything he knew about the film or its production. As the weeks passed, those who knew him began noticing unsettling changes in his behavior. He became reclusive, cutting off contact with colleagues and friends. His lectures and research projects were abandoned without explanation. On the rare occasion he spoke with others, he was described as agitated, muttering about how the reel was unfinished and how it needed him to complete its story. At one point, he referred to the footage not as it, but as him, as though the reel were a living presence. Then came the announcement of a special screening at a small, independent theater. The event was advertised as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to view a newly discovered reel of Nosferatu. The historian framed it as an extraordinary historical find, something that would redefine the legacy of the film. The screening began normally, with the historian introducing the reel. Attendees later described him as pale and visibly nervous, his voice trembling as he spoke. The theater was packed that night, filled with students, film buffs, and fellow academics eager to see this mysterious footage. When the film started, the audience was immediately struck by its strangeness. The imagery was disjointed and unsettling, with shadows that seemed to ripple and shift in ways that didn't match the movement of the characters. Several attendees reported feeling an oppressive sense of unease, as though the film were actively watching them. At some point during the screening, the historian slipped out of the projection booth. Without anyone noticing, he locked the main theater doors from the outside and doused the entrance with gasoline. Moments later, he lit the fire. Panic broke out inside the theater as smoke filled the room. Some audience members managed to escape through emergency exits or by breaking windows, but others weren't so lucky. When the fire was extinguished, the historian's body was found near the theater entrance, burned beyond recognition. The reel itself was presumed destroyed in the blaze, though no fragments were ever recovered. Survivors of the event described the footage in cryptic, fragmented ways. Some claimed to have seen the shadows on the screen moving independently, extending outwards as though they were trying to escape from the frame. Others swore that the figure resembling Murnau had turned to face the audience, speaking in a low, incomprehensible voice that seemed to echo in their minds long after they had fled. But they all agreed on one thing: the reel was unlike anything they had ever seen. In the aftermath, the incident was officially ruled an accident, attributed to faulty wiring in the old theater. The historian's name and career were quietly erased from most records, his work overshadowed by the tragedy. The story has since become one of the darker legends surrounding Nosferatu. Whether the reel truly existed, or was simply a fragment of the historian's deteriorating mind, remains a matter of speculation. But those who were there that night insist the film was real, and that it was never meant to be seen. What's undeniable is the film's uncanny ability to survive, despite every effort to destroy it. With a new version of Nosferatu now in theaters, interest in the film's history and lost reels can only increase. But if the rumors of the curse are true, we can only hope if any copies of those lost reels still exist, they are locked away, somewhere no one can ever find them.